We have all heard the stories, the void-born tales of the Orks shouted from the pulpits of drunken pilots in the darkest corners of spaceports. We know them as a plague, a green tide of mindless violence that sweeps across the galaxy. We fight them, we burn them, and if we are lucky, we die quickly in the attempt. But to be captured, to be taken alive, that is a fate the Imperium does not prepare you for. It is a silence that follows the thunder of war, a dread that gnaws deeper than any fear of a clean death. They say the Emperor protects, but in the dark, dripping holds of an Ork rock or the rusted cages of their squig-infested camps, you learn a terrible truth. His light does not reach there. There is only the green. There is only the Wa. My name is Captain Revis of the Cadian 112th. This is not a story of heroism. This is a testament, a record of what happens when the guns fall silent and the real horror begins. This is what it is like to be a prisoner of the Orks. The last thing I remembered was the sound. Not the whine of lasgun fire, not the guttural war cries of the greenskins, not even the earth-shattering detonation of artillery. It was the sound of the world ending. A percussive, grinding roar that tore reality in two. A noise so profound it felt less like a sound and more like the death of hope itself. We were holding the line on the agri-world of Viridia Secundus, a pathetic speck of dirt and chlorophyll the Orks had deemed worthy of a foit. For 72 hours, the Cadian 112 had stood firm, a bastion of imperial might against the green tide. Our lasgun volleys stitched red lines through the advancing horde, and for a moment, drenched in the sacred sweat and ozone of battle, I, Captain Revis, dared to believe in the impossible. I dared to believe we would win. That arrogance was my first and greatest sin. The Ork battle wagon didn't so much attack as it occurred. It was a geological event given form, a ramshackle cathedral of rust, rivets, and pure, undiluted malevolence. It wasn't a vehicle built. It was a collection of scrap metal that had somehow achieved a critical mass of violence and begun to move. Its hull was a patchwork of stolen Imperial tank plating, fused with jagged sheets of adamantium and adorned with spikes upon which the bodies of my fellow soldiers were impaled, their corpses twitching in the electric wind of its passage. Its primary gun was an abomination, a massive, spiraling barrel that looked like a dozen drainpipes welded together by a madman, glowing with an internal, sickly green energy. It plowed through our central redoubt as if our fortified positions were sandcastles before a tsunami. The earth itself screamed in protest, the ground turning into a bloody quagmire of mud, ceramite, and flesh. I saw Lieutenant Karras, a man who had stood beside me on the walls of Cadia itself, raise his plasma pistol in a final, defiant act. A gout of incandescent green vomited from the battle wagon's main gun. There was no projectile, only a wave of concussive force that atomized him, his command squad, and the 30 meters of trench they occupied. The shock wave hit me like a physical blow, and my command chimera, Emperor's Fury, was lifted from the ground and thrown end over end. The world became a cacophony of shrieking metal and the sickening, final crunch of my own bones. I was a rag doll in a tin can, my helmet cracking against the reinforced hull with a wet, definitive sound. The blessed darkness, warm and inviting, reached for me, promising an end to the pain, a warrior's rest in the God-Emperor's light. I did not embrace it. A different kind of darkness took me, a living darkness, one that stank of fungus, blood, and crude promethium. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a brutal awakening to a new kind of pain. It wasn't the sharp, clean agony of a lasburn or the searing heat of shrapnel. This was a deep systemic thrumming, a vibration that started in the fillings of my teeth and resonated deep within the marrow of my bones. It was the heartbeat of the beast that had swallowed me. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with 1,000 abominable smells. The coppery tang of fresh blood mixed with the greasy fungal reek of unwashed orc flesh. The eye-watering pungency of burning promethium and ozone warred with a sweet, cloying stench of rot and decay, the smell of things that had died and been left to fester in the dark. I was moving, or rather, I was being moved. I lay in a heap of other bodies, a tangled mass of broken humanity. Some still wore the tattered, blood-soaked gray of the Cadian 112. Others were in the drab greens of the local PDF, their uniforms now little more than rags. We were piled in the back of a groaning, clattering vehicle, its engine a discordant roar of poorly tuned cylinders. The floor was slick with a vile mixture of blood, black oil, and something else that was unpleasantly organic and slippery. Through the slats of the crude, rusted cage that contained us, I could see the world outside. We were no longer on the plains of Viridia. We had been transported into a canyon of scrap, a teetering, impossible city of wreckage that blotted out the very sky. This was the underbelly of an orc rock, a ramshackle collection of ships, asteroids, and pure debris that served as their vessel and their fortress. We were inside the monster. A low, pained moan escaped from the body next to me. It was a young trooper, his face a mask of congealed blood, one arm bent at an impossible angle beneath him. His eyes, wide with shock and a pain so profound it transcended the physical, met mine. The Cadian gate symbol on his collar was smeared with grime. "Captain," he rasped, his voice the sound of dry leaves scraping against stone. "Is it over?" "Stay quiet, son," I whispered, my own throat raw and tight. Every word was a knife. "Conserve your strength. The Emperor protects." The Emperor?" he repeated, a flicker of faith in his dying eyes. He will send the Astartes? He will—" He never finished his prayer. A massive, three-fingered hand, the skin a vile pustular green and thick with crude tribal scars, shot through the bars of the cage with shocking speed. It was not a hand, it was a weapon, each finger as thick as my wrist. It ignored me, bypassing the other bodies, and closed around the young trooper's leg with a sound like a butcher snapping a chicken bone. The boy's eyes widened further, his mouth opening in a silent O of shock. Then he was ripped from the pile, his broken body offering no resistance. He was yanked through the bars with a terrible, wet, tearing sound. His scream when it came was short, sharp, and ended in a loud, percussive crunch. This was followed by the sound of wet, enthusiastic chewing and a guttural orc laugh that was somehow more alien and horrifying than any weapon they possessed. I froze. My mind, a tool honed for warfare, for complex tactics and the sacred geometries of honor, simply refused to process the sensory input. This was not capture. This was not imprisonment as a prisoner of war. This was predation. We were not soldiers. We were livestock. The vehicle ground to a bone-jarring halt. The back of the cage was thrown open with a screech of protesting metal, and the blinding, sickly green light of the rock's interior flooded in, stinging my light-starved eyes. Silhouetted against the hellish glow were two hulking orcs, larger than any I had seen on the battlefield. They were monsters from a child's most fevered nightmare given flesh and muscle. One had a crude metal jaw that clacked as it grinned, a single bloodshot eye gleaming with a simple, brutal joy. The other had a power claw, a monstrous contraption of rusty metal and crackling energy fields that looked like it could tear a Lehman Russ battle tank in half with a single gesture. The one with the metal jaw reached in. It didn't bother to select its prey. It was not culling the weak or choosing the strong. It was simply emptying the container. It grabbed the nearest body, a PDF soldier who was clearly already dead, his chest a cavernous wound, and tossed him out onto the hard ground like a sack of refuse. Then it grabbed a live one, a woman who shrieked and clawed at the metal floor, her fingernails tearing and bleeding. She met the same fate, her screams cut off as she landed with a sickening thud. This was the selection process. There was no intelligence to it, no strategic malice beyond the base reptilian pleasure of causing fear. It was random, impersonal, and utterly, soul-destroyingly horrifying. Then the single eye of the metal-jawed orc fixed on me. It grunted, a sound like rocks grinding together in a swamp, and pointed. The one with the power claw turned. Its claw, a monstrous thing of pistons and blades, hissed as it reached for me. I braced myself, my hand instinctively going for the last pistol that was long gone, my mind screaming prayers of defiance that died in my throat. The cold, sharp metal fingers closed around my torso, the pressure immense, threatening to pop my ribs like dry twigs. I was lifted into the air, dangling, face to face with the orc. Its breath was a physical blow, a fog of decay, raw meat, and a strange fungal stench. Its single bloodshot eye looked me over, not with hatred, not with curiosity, but with a kind of appraisal. The way a chef might inspect a piece of meat, judging its marbling and potential. It was a look that stripped me of my rank, my name, my humanity. I was just a thing. It grunted again, a non-committal sound. Then, with a casual flick of its wrist, it threw me. I sailed through the air for what felt like an eternity, a helpless doll in the grip of giants. I landed in a heap on a hard, rock-like surface, the impact driving the air from my lungs. I lay there, gasping, my body a symphony of pain. Slowly, pushing myself up with trembling arms, I looked around. I was in a vast, cavernous space, a grotto carved from the heart of the rock itself. The ceiling was lost in darkness, from which hung stalactites of rust and dripping water. And all around me, stretching into the gloom in every direction, were cages. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. They were stacked haphazardly like firewood, hung from rusted chains that groaned under the strain, built into the very walls of the cavern. They were made of scrap metal, bone, and hardened fungal matter. And in every cage, a human face, pale, gaunt, and etched with a despair so profound it was a physical presence in the air, a cold mist that seeped into the soul. This was not a prison. This was a larder, a pantry for a race of sentient carnivores. The silence here was the most terrifying thing of all. It wasn't the absence of sound, It was the absence of hope. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from whimpers of pain, the slow drip of water, and the quiet, desperate sobs of those who had given up. It was the sound of 10,000 souls waiting to be broken. The God Emperor's light did not reach this place. There was only the green. There was only the Wa. And I was now a part of it. The Nob looked the group over, his piggy eyes scanning them with a practiced butcher's gaze. He pointed a thick green finger at one man who was stumbling, weaker and slower than the rest. The man fell to his knees, raising his hands in a futile gesture of supplication. The Nob stepped forward, grabbed the man by the head with one massive hand, and with a casual, almost bored motion gave a sharp twist. There was a sickening, wet pop, like a cork being pulled from a bottle, followed by the crunch of vertebrae. He ripped the man's head from his shoulders with an effortless motion that spoke of immense, casual strength. He held the severed head aloft, letting the arterial blood pour into his open, laughing maw. The body convulsed at his feet for a few moments before lying still. The other humans screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that was quickly drowned out by the roaring laughter of the orcs surrounding them. It was a sound of amusement, of entertainment. Our suffering was their comedy. The big Nob tossed the head aside like a piece of discarded fruit and bellowed again. The grots, now energized and chattering, began herding the remaining terrified humans away, down a dark, dripping tunnel that seemed to swallow the light. "They're not feeding us," Kage repeated, his voice grim and absolute. "They're culling us, weeding out the weak, the strong." He let the sentence hang in the foul air, his gaze drifting towards the fighting pit we had seen earlier, and then towards the dark opening of the Painboy's lair. The strong they have other uses for. The purpose of our imprisonment was now horrifyingly crystal clear. We were not prisoners of war. We were a resource, a renewable one as long as their galactic raids continued. The weak were sport, a quick snack, a way to pass the time. The strong were for labor, for the fighting pits, or for something far, far worse. We were not people. We were things, assets in the orc economy of violence. That night, or what passed for it, in the eternal, artificial gloom of the cavern, the boy in our cage died. He simply stopped breathing. There was no final gasp, no last whispered prayer. One moment he was a curled-up form of misery, the next he was an empty shell. Kage, with a practicality that was both chilling and utterly necessary for survival, moved over to the body. He searched the boy's pockets and person with a methodical efficiency, looking for anything that could be of use. A hidden blade, a scrap of cloth, anything. There was nothing. The orcs had been thorough. Then, without a word of ceremony or a moment of hesitation, Kage dragged the body to the edge of the cage and, with a single powerful shove, sent it tumbling down to the cavern floor below. It landed with a dull, meaty thud that made Ilara whimper and turn away. I forced myself to watch. This was our reality now. Sentiment was a luxury we could not afford. Dignity in death was a fairy tale. A few minutes later, a grot patrol, looking like vultures drawn to carrion, found the body.
They didn't look surprised or alarmed. This was a routine occurrence. They simply hooked the corpse with their poles, chattering to each other in their high-pitched, annoying tongues, and began dragging it away in the same direction the other culled prisoners had been taken. "Where are they taking him?" Ilara asked, her voice hollow, her face pale. Kaji just looked at her, his expression unreadable, a mask of scar tissue and grim acceptance. "The same place they take all the scraps. We were in the belly of the beast, and the beast was always, always hungry, and we were on the menu."
Time became a meaningless concept, measured only in the slow, rhythmic dripping of moisture from the cavern ceiling, and the occasional terrifying crescendo of orcish violence that echoed through the vast space. My new home was a cage of rusted iron bars, roughly 2 meters square, suspended about 10 feet off the ground by a single groaning chain that seemed to protest with every slight movement. It was a shared coffin, occupied by 3 other souls, each a monument to a different kind of breaking. The first was a mountain of a man who identified himself only as Kage, from the death world of Katachan, where I was lean and hardened by Cadia's disciplined warfare. He was sheer, raw bulk, his muscles coiled like steel springs beneath a canvas of scar tissue and faded green tattoos. He sat in the far corner, not with despair, but with a predator's stillness. His eyes like chips of obsidian, constantly scanning, assessing, and filing away every detail of our hell. He was a weapon waiting to be used, and the silence around him was that of a primed grenade. The second occupant was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 17, from the Viridian PDF. His uniform was soiled, and not just with the grime of the cage. The sharp, acrid smell of urine and fear clung to him. He rocked back and forth, ceaselessly, his arms wrapped around his knees, whispering the same litany of protection to the god Emperor over and over, a desperate mantra against the overwhelming terror. "And though I walk through the valley of the shadow of the pestilence, I shall fear no evil, for thou art with me." His faith was a fragile shell, and it was cracking with every hour. The third was a woman named Ilara, her once neat munitorium scribe robes now torn and stained. She was the opposite of the boy. Where he was frantic movement, she was absolute stillness. She sat with her back against the bars, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the grimy metal floor, as if the intricate patterns of rust and filth held the answers to this cosmic injustice. Her shock was so deep it had become a state of being, a quiet catatonia that was, in its own way, more frightening than the boy's terror. There was no food, no water. The Orks did not provide sustenance. They merely allowed us to exist until we were needed. The only interruptions to the oppressive, bone-shaking vibration of the rock's engines were the occasional earth-shaking roars of distant Ork mobs, or the sudden, piercing shriek of a human from another cage, followed by a chorus of guttural Ork laughter and the wet, final sounds of consumption. Hours bled into what I guessed were days. Thirst became a fire in my throat, a desert consuming me from the inside. Hunger was a dull, grinding ache in my gut that slowly sharpened into a series of painful cramps. The boy's prayers became weaker, more fragmented, his voice a dry rasp. "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." On what I mentally catalogued as the third day, his voice finally gave out. The whispering stopped. He simply lay down, curled into a tight fetal position, and fell silent. His chest still rose and fell in shallow breaths, but the light in his eyes had been extinguished. He had not died. He had simply retreated. His soul had fled the prison of his body, seeking a refuge the Orks could not violate. It was Kage who finally broke our collective silence. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, a sound that seemed to be forged in the jungles of his homeworld, barely audible over the ambient din of the cavern. "They're not feeding us," he stated. It wasn't a question, nor a lament. It was a simple, brutal fact, delivered with the flat finality of a headsman's axe. Elara, stirred from her stupor, looked up. A flicker of pathetic, desperate life returned to her eyes. They must, to keep us alive, for labor. The Munitorium protocols state that for forced labor to be efficient, caloric intake must be— Kage cut her off with a slow, deliberate shake of his head, his flinty gaze fixed on the cavern floor below our suspended prison. "Look." I followed his gaze. Below us was a vast, open area, a sort of central thoroughfare for the Orks. It was here we saw them in their element for the first time, not as a faceless horde, but as a functioning, if utterly deranged, society. They were not just brutes, they were a culture of pure distilled anarchy. They fought each other with the same ferocity they'd shown us on the battlefield, brawling over scraps of moldy food, over shinier bits of junk, or for no discernible reason at all. Their language was a series of grunts, bellows, and barks, a cacophony that grated on the mind. But a few words, mangled and brutalized into a form of low Gothic, were repeated often enough to become recognizable. Fight, gun, shiny, wah! And then we saw the grots, smaller, scrawnier, and infinitely more malicious versions of their Ork masters. They scurried through the crowds like rats on two legs. They whined and cowered when an Ork backhanded them across the cavern, yet they carried out their tasks with a sniveling, resentful energy, often taking out their frustrations on us, the prisoners, with sharp jabs from their spears. One of their primary tasks became horrifyingly clear. A massive Ork, larger than the others and adorned with a spiked helmet and a necklace of human skulls that still had tatters of flesh clinging to them, strode into the center of the thoroughfare. He was a nob, an overseer of this nightmare. He bellowed a command, a single word that sounded like "Gits." A squad of grots, wielding sharp, hooked poles, scrambled towards a row of low-lying cages, ones that seemed to hold the weakest, most emaciated prisoners. They unlocked one and began jabbing and prodding at the occupants, herding them out. A dozen walking skeletons, their faces hollowed out by starvation, stumbled into the open, blinking in the foul light.
The selection came without warning, as all things did in this place. There was no schedule, no pattern to the Orcs' cruelty, only the ever-present threat that could manifest at any moment. A band of Orcs, distinct from the common mob, stalked through the cavern with a purposeful swagger. These were the nobs, the overseers and enforcers, bigger, meaner, and more adorned with trophies and crude cybernetics than their lesser kin. They moved with the arrogant confidence of sharks in blood-filled water, pointing and grunting at the cages, their guttural barks echoing in the vast space. One of them, a brute whose right arm had been replaced with a hydraulic-powered metal fist the size of a small crate, stopped directly below our cage. He looked up at us, his piggy eyes, small and deep-set in a skull of green muscle, scanning each face with a lazy, predatory interest. They settled on Cage. "You, biggin, down 'ere," he bellowed and mangled, barely comprehensible low Gothic. The words were slurred and thick, but the command was unmistakable. Cage didn't flinch. He didn't plead or show fear. He merely stood, his posture shifting from stillness to a coiled, lethal readiness. He was a spring being compressed. The cage door was unlocked with a loud clang, and a rickety ladder made of lashed-together scrap metal was shoved against it. Cage climbed down, his movements slow and deliberate, his obsidian eyes never leaving the knob. It wasn't a look of defiance, but of assessment. He was studying his enemy, even now. The orc grinned, a horrific sight that revealed a mouthful of thick, yellowed tusks and broken teeth. "Think you're odd, Yumi? We'll see." He grabbed Cage by the chain that still bound his wrists and dragged him off towards the center of the cavern, towards the circular area dug into the floor, the pit. Ilara began to weep silently, her shoulders shaking. I could only watch, my fists clenched so tight that my ragged nails drew blood from my palms. This was the true essence of orc prison, the final, complete and utter removal of agency. We were objects, and now one of us was being taken for testing, for use. We were utterly powerless. They took Cage to the pit, a crude arena about 20 meters across, surrounded by a fence of sharpened scrap metal in bone. Orcs of all sizes were already gathering around it, jostling for the best positions, bellowing and arguing. I saw them exchanging teeth, actual pulled teeth that served as their currency, placing bets on the outcome of the spectacle to come. Cage was shoved into the center of the muddy, blood-soaked circle. A moment later, a second prisoner was thrown in from the opposite side. He was a hulking brute of a man from some feral world, his body covered in swirling tribal tattoos, his head shaved. He looked terrified, but his fear had been forged in the fires of a harsh world into a sharp, wild edge of desperation. He was an animal backed into a corner. An orc spectator, caught up in the excitement, fired a crude shotgun into the air. The sound was enormous, a definitive start to the horror. The fight was on. The feral worlder, driven by pure panic, charged with a raw-throated roar. It was all rage and no technique, a blind, furious lunge. Cage didn't move. He stood like a rock, a statue of muscle and will. At the very last second, as the man was upon him, Cage sidestepped with the grace of a jungle predator, grabbed the man's charging arm, and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the hard-packed, bloodied earth. There was a wet, cracking sound like a melon being dropped. The man went instantly limp, his neck broken. It was over in 3 seconds. The orcs roared, a deafening wave of sound that was a mixture of approval and disappointment. They appreciated the efficiency, the sheer power of the move, but it had been too quick. There had been no prolonged struggle, no exchange of blows, no entertainment. The knob who had taken Cage looked particularly annoyed, his metal fist clenching and unclenching. He had expected more of a show from the biggin. He barked a new order, his voice cutting through the din. This time, they didn't send in another human. They were upping the stakes. A smaller cage was opened, and they released a squig. It was a monstrous thing, a blasphemy against nature. A ball of pure, rippling muscle in rage, about the size of a large dog, with stubby, powerful legs. It had no eyes, just a single gaping mouth that took up most of its body, filled with row upon row of serrated, razor-sharp teeth.
It hopped into the pit, its body quivering, and let out a high-pitched, ear-splitting screech before launching itself at Cage in a blur of motion. Cage met the charge. What followed was a brutal, primal dance of survival. He dodged the squig's first lunge with an incredible display of agility, delivering a powerful, stomping kick to the creature's side that made it squeal in anger and pain. But the squig was fast, unnaturally so. It twisted in mid-air with impossible flexibility, and its teeth sank deep into Cage's thigh. Cage grunted, a sharp, pained exhalation, but he didn't cry out. Instead, he funneled the agony into fury. He brought his manacled fists down on the creature's head like twin sledgehammers, once, twice, 3 times. The sound was sickening, a wet, percussive thudding of fist against muscle and bone. The squig, dazed and in pain, released its grip. Cage didn't hesitate. This was the kill. He grabbed the grotesque, writhing creature, and with a final, monumental effort, born of a lifetime of fighting things that wanted to eat him, he slammed it against the ground with all his strength, then stomped on its head repeatedly until it stopped moving, its body twitching in its death throes. Silence for a single, weighty moment. Then the Orks erupted into a deafening, unified cheer. They loved it. They appreciated pure, unadulterated violence, no matter the source. Cage had won. He had survived.
Grim, weary, as if recounting a forgotten heresy. But survival here came with a price. It always did. The knob was no longer looking at Cage with annoyance, but with a kind of acquisitive interest. He had proven his worth, his hardness. He was a keeper. The knob pointed at Cage, then pointed towards a dark, foul-smelling opening on the far side of the cavern, an orifice from which strange, buzzing sounds, the shrieks of tortured metal and pained, gurgling screams emanated. "The pain boy wants him," the knob roared to the crowd, which cheered its approval. "He's a keeper." Cage was bleeding profusely from the deep bite wound on his leg, was dragged limping towards that dark opening. He was losing strength, his body finally succumbing to the shock and blood loss. As he was hauled away, he managed to turn his head and look back at our Cage just once. His flinty eyes met mine. There was no fear in them, no plea for help, only a cold, hard, unambiguous warning, a glimpse of what was to come. The pain boy. I'd heard the legends, the campfire stories told by grizzled veterans to scare the new recruits, orc medics. But their idea of medicine was a form of creative torture that would make a dark Eldar homunculus reconsider his life choices. They didn't heal, they improved. They saw a living body as a collection of parts to be augmented, replaced, and experimented upon, with no regard for pain, biology, or sanity. To be taken by the pain boy was to become raw material. Cage was gone for a long, long time. The sounds from the cavern continued, the orcs going about their chaotic business. But for Alara and me, the world had shrunk to that dark opening. We waited, our own fates feeling inextricably linked to his. When they finally brought him back, he was barely conscious, a broken doll in the hands of a grot patrol. They didn't carry him gently. They threw him back into our cage like a piece of modified machinery, his body landing with a heavy, limp thud. The transformation was horrifying. His leg wound had been crudely, brutally stapled shut with a series of large, rusty metal clamps that bit deep into his flesh. The wound was still seeping blood and a yellowish pus, but that wasn't the worst of it.
It was his arm. His right arm was gone, severed cleanly at the elbow. In its place was a brutal, piston-driven hydraulic claw, a smaller, cruder version of the power claw the knobs wielded. It was all jagged metal and exposed wiring, a mess of rusted pistons and sharpened pincers. Wires and tubes pulsing with a sickly green light snaked from the base of the claw directly into the raw sutured flesh of his stump. The Orks had grafted their own technology directly onto his body. His face was pale and waxy, sweat beaded on his brow despite the cavern's chill. He trembled uncontrollably, caught in the throes of a massive fever and systemic shock. He was mumbling, caught in a fever dream, his words slurred and fragmented. The noise in my head, it won't stop. The green, it talks, it itches, inside my skull. The Orks hadn't just patched him up. They had claimed part of him. They had made him a little bit orc. The crude bionics were more than just a weapon. They were a conduit. As I looked at that brutal, powerful claw, I realized a new, deeper layer of the horror. The strong weren't just used for labor or sport. They were raw material for the Orks' own mad science. They were turning us into weapons against ourselves, against our own kind. They were assimilating us not into their culture, but into their monstrous physiology. Cage's survival in the pit had not been a victory. It had been a transformation, a damnation. And I knew, with a chilling certainty that froze the blood in my veins, that a fate worse than death was waiting for all of us in the buzzing, screaming workshop of the Pain Boy. The strong were not spared. They were simply repurposed.
Cug's fever was a living entity in our cramped cage. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, a span of time measured in his thrashing limbs and delirious mutterings. His new claw, a dead weight of metal and malice, would twitch and hiss, the pistons firing erratically. Sometimes it would snap shut with a violent pneumatic crack, the sound so loud and sharp it made Alara jump every time. If the cage bars had been any less thick, I was certain the claw's force could have shattered them. We were trapped not just with a man, but with the weapon they had grafted onto him. Alara and I did what we could, which was nothing. We had no water to cool his burning brow, no rags to staunch the seepage from his stapled leg, no medicine to fight the infection that was clearly raging through his system, turning his skin hot and clammy. We could only watch him suffer, a living, breathing testament to the Orks' blasphemous and utterly pragmatic art. He was their masterpiece of repurposing, and his agony was an irrelevant byproduct. The only thing that seemed to exert a calming influence on his tormented psyche was the distant, rhythmic chanting of the Ork mobs, the guttural wah that would periodically swell through the cavern. It was as if the raw, psychic energy of it, that pervasive field that bound them all together in a symphony of violence, resonated with the crude bionics grafted to his body. The green light in the wires would pulse in time with the chants, and his trembling would lessen. It was a horrifying observation. Were they not just modifying his body, but somehow making him attuned to them on a fundamental psychic level? Were they making him one of them, not in spirit, but in the very resonance of his being? When the fever finally broke, it did so not with a sigh of relief, but with a hollowing out. The man who had been a bastion of stoic catechin strength was now diminished. The fire in his eyes had been replaced by a distant, glazed look, as if he were staring at something far beyond the rusted bars of our prison. He would sit for hours, not moving,
just staring at his new claw, opening and closing the pincers with a slow, deliberate hiss of pneumatics. The faint, sickly green light from the internal wiring reflected in his pupils, casting a faint emerald sheen across his vision. It itches, he said one time, his voice a dry, rasping thing like stones grinding in a desert. But the itch, it's inside my bones, in my head. He tapped his temple with his human hand, a slow, deliberate tap. They put things in my head, little green thoughts. They whisper. He was becoming a stranger in his own skin. The Mad Doc, the Ork pain boy, had not just operated on his body, he had performed a crude psychic lobotomy on his soul. The process of breaking us was not always through overt violence. Sometimes it was this slow, insidious transformation. It was around this time that our rations began. The concept was so absurd it would have been laughable in any other context. A grot, sniveling and malicious, would occasionally sling a bucket of foul, lumpy gruel into the cage. The substance was cold, tasteless, and had the gritty consistency of wet sand mixed with gravel. Sometimes there were recognizable or semi-recognizable chunks in it. What looked like stringy, undercooked squig meat, or perhaps even something less palatable. We ate it. We had no choice. Hunger is a master that overrides all disgust, all dignity. It was fuel, nothing more. The body's desperate need to continue existing, even when the mind begged for release. Then, the selection came from me. It was the same knob with the hydraulic fist. His name, I had learned from the bellows of other orcs, was Gitsnaka. He stomped below our cage, his single eye scanning upwards. It passed over the catatonic Alara, over the transformed cog, and settled on me. I was the only one who still looked like I had a functioning officer's mind behind my eyes. He pointed his crude, power-clawed finger. "You, bossy-looking one, down here!" My blood ran cold, a glacier forming in my veins. Ilara stirred from her stupor, gasped, and shrank back into the corner as if trying to merge with the rusted metal. Cog didn't even look up. He was lost in his green-tinged world. I was the next piece of raw material on the assembly line of nightmares. I was dragged from the cage, not towards the fighting pit, but straight towards the dark opening from which Cog had emerged, the source of the buzzing and the screams, the workshop of the Mad Doc. With every step, the stench grew stronger, a palpable wave of corruption that assaulted the senses. The smell that hit me as I was shoved inside was an order of magnitude worse than the general funk of the rock. It was a chemical cocktail designed to offend life itself. The harsh, burning reek of crude antiseptics that smelled more like acid, the ozone from wildly arcing electrical currents, the thick, coppery smell of fresh blood, the sweet, putrid odor of rotting flesh and infection, and beneath it all, the pervasive, cloying sweetness of fungal decay. The air itself hummed with the power of poorly shielded generators and the frantic, high-pitched whine of rusty drills and bone saws. The chamber was a gallery of anatomical nightmares. It was larger than I had imagined, a cave within a cave, lit by flickering, strobing lights and the glow of welding torches. Bodies, both human and orc, in various states of disassembly and reassembly, hung from meat hooks on the walls like sides of beef in a slaughterhouse. Some were missing limbs, others had their chest cavities splayed open, revealing grotesque cybernetic additions. Jars filled with floating, unidentifiable organs and staring eyes lined crude shelves carved from the rock. In one corner, a large bubbling vat of green liquid contained what looked like a dozen squigs melded into a single, shrieking mass of flesh,
A failed experiment that was still horrifyingly alive.
And in the center of it all, under the brightest and most erratic light, was the Mad Doc himself. He was taller and lankier than a typical orc, almost spidery in his movements. He was dressed in a leather apron so encrusted with blood and filth it was stiff, and it was impossible to tell what its original color had been. Goggles with multiple spinning lenses were strapped to his face, and his hands— no, they weren't hands. They were a collection of crude surgical tools, buzzsaws, bone drills, clamps, and syringes large enough to be used as spears, all grafted directly onto his arms, replacing his hands entirely. He was hunched over a groaning orc on a stone slab that served as an operating table, cheerfully using a whirring power saw to amputate the orc's leg, which was mangled, gangrenous, and crawling with maggots. "Just a little off the top," the doc cackled, his voice a gleeful, screeching sound that grated on the nerves. "We'll get you a new one, a better one. Maybe with a rocket on it." He sawed through the bone with a final, grating shriek, tossed the infected leg into a pile of other discarded limbs, and then, without any semblance of sterilization, grabbed a new leg from a nearby bin. This one was a crude, mechanical prosthetic, ending in a tractor tread. He began hammering it onto the orc's stump, with a large, rusty mallet, each blow landing with a wet, cracking sound. The orc on the table, instead of screaming in agony, was laughing uproariously, urging him on. "Faster, Doc. I got to get back to the fight." This was their reality. Pain was not a thing to be avoided or managed. It was a sensation to be endured, even enjoyed, a prelude to being improved, to be harder, stronger, and more killy. It was a worldview so alien, so insane, that it threatened to shatter my own. The doc finished his work with a final thunderous hammer blow that made the orc on the table jolt. The orc, with the new tread leg, hopped off the table, stomped his new appendage a few times, and let out a bellow of approval before lumbering out, eager to test his new acquisition. The doc then turned his multi-lensed gaze on me. The various lenses whirred and clicked, focusing. A long, thick, green tongue snaked out and licked his metal lips. "Ooh, a new one. A shiny Yumi," he screeched, his tool hands twitching with excitement. "You's a bit scrawny, but we can fix that. Lots of room for improvements." I was slammed onto the cold, sticky stone slab. The surface was slick with blood and other, less identifiable fluids. Rusted metal restraints, cold and unforgiving, clamped down on my wrists and ankles with jarring force. I struggled, a primal, futile instinct, but it was like trying to bend solid rock. The dock loomed over me, a nightmare silhouette against the flickering lights. A selection of whirring, buzzing tools descended from the ceiling on mechanical, jointed arms, their tips glowing with heat or spinning with lethal intent. "What's wrong with this one?" he mused to himself, not expecting an answer. He poked me in the ribs with a sharp, probe-like tool, making me grunt in pain. "Too quiet, not enough daka." He cackled at his own joke, the sound echoing in the chamber. I braced myself. I prepared for the cut, the searing pain, the amputation, the horror of being remade into a monstrosity like Cage. I closed my eyes,
offering a final, silent prayer to the Emperor for the strength to endure or the mercy of a swift death. But then he paused. I heard one of his lenses whir, clicking through different magnifications. He leaned in close, his foul, chemical, and decay breath washing over my face. The primary lens focused on my eyes. "Nah," he muttered, a note of disappointment in his screechy voice. "You's got boss eyes. Thinky eyes." He tapped my forehead with a clamp-like tool, a cold, hard touch. He gestured with a drill-tipped arm to Gitsnacka, who was waiting by the entrance. "Take him to the Mekboyz yard. He likes the smart gits. He can make 'em talk to the machines." The restraints released with a sudden clang. I was hauled off the slab, my legs buckling underneath me, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had been spared the surgeon's table, but I felt no relief, only a colder, more insidious dread. I was being transferred from one horror to another. The Mad Doc's workshop was a place of physical, bodily transgression, of visceral hell. What fresh, psychological damnation awaited me in the Mekboyz yard? As I was dragged out, stumbling and weak, I saw the Doc had already moved on, his attention span that of a gnat. A grot was dragging a sobbing, struggling PDF soldier towards the now vacant slab. The Doc was sharpening a particularly large serrated saw on a grinding wheel, sending sparks flying. "Now for you," he giggled, the sound pure, unadulterated madness. "Let's see if we can make your head live without a body, for giggles." The soldier's screams followed me out into the cavern, a soundtrack to my own uncertain fate. I had been judged, not strong enough for the pit, but too intelligent for simple dismemberment. I was to be a tool for the Orks' mechanical whims. My mind, the one thing I had left, my last sanctuary, was now the target.
The grim, weary, as if recounting a forgotten heresy. The Mekboyz yard was a different circle of hell altogether. If the Doc's workshop was a charnel house of flesh, this was a temple to mechanical insanity. The air, thick with black smoke and the acrid stench of ozone, superheated metal and burning promethium, was a physical presence that coated the lungs. The noise was a constant, deafening cacophony, a symphony of hammers pounding against metal, welders sizzling and spitting blinding arcs of light, the screech of tortured steel and the percussive boom of experimental weapons detonating prematurely, often taking a grot or two with them. It was a place where the very concept of engineering had been taken out back and beaten to death with a wrench. I was thrown into a fenced-off pen filled with other prisoners. These were not the broken bodies from the cages, nor the muscle for the pits. These men had the hollow, intelligent eyes of tech adepts, engine seers, and a few junior officers like myself who had been deemed to have boss eyes or thinky eyes. We were the smart gits, a resource to be exploited in a different way. Our value was not in our strength, but in the knowledge trapped within our skulls. Our task was not to fight, but to help. A Mekboy, a hulking orc perpetually covered in welding goggles, tool belts, and an assortment of crude bionics, would stomp over to our pen. He would point a grease-blackened finger at a jumbled mess of scrap metal, tangled wiring, and what looked like salvaged engine parts, and bark orders in his unique, techno-barbaric language. "Make this go," he'd grunt,
kicking a disembodied, heavily modified engine block that was missing half its components. Or, "Make the shooty bit hit that," he'd command, pointing first to a rusting fuel drum 100 meters away and then to a massive, multi-barreled cannon that was missing its entire breech mechanism and any form of ammunition feed. It was a form of psychological torture meticulously designed to break a rational mind. We were being forced to apply imperial logic, the sacred tenets of the machine god, and principles of physics to a system that was fundamentally, gloriously illogical. Ork technology, I was beginning to understand on a visceral level, did not work on principles of engineering or known physical laws. It worked on belief, on the sheer collective psychic will of the war underfield. A red vehicle went faster, not because of aerodynamics, but because every Ork believed red ones did. A gun with no visible ammunition source could still fire, because the Ork pulling the trigger believed it should, and the Gestalt psychic field made it so. Our job was to somehow bridge that impossible gap, to take their insane, half-formed designs and, using our Yumi Cunnin, make them look like they should work. By applying a veneer of logical assembly, we were reinforcing the Orks' belief, greasing the wheels of their madness, and making their impossible technology actually function. We were accomplices in our own subjugation, using our intellect to empower our captors. Failure was met with a swift and brutal response. An engine seer from the forge world of Ryza, a man named Farron, who had spent his entire life venerating the machine god and understanding the sacred flow of electromotive force, was tasked with stabilizing a wildly fluctuating power core. He tried to explain to the Mekboy, a particularly irritable brute named Uzgob, why the core's energy output was critically unstable, that the wiring was fundamentally wrong, that it would detonate. See, the tertiary plasma conduit is cross-wired with the primary coolant feed. It creates a recursive energy loop that will lead to a catastrophic failure. We must reroute the... Uzgob, annoyed by the whiny human, simply grabbed the violently shuddering power core from Farron's hands and shoved it into a socket on the engine he was working on. "Stop your yapping! It goes there, see?" he bellowed, as if stating a simple, obvious fact. The engine, a ramshackle thing meant for a war bike, coughed once, belched a cloud of black smoke, and then roared to life, thrumming with power. Jagged arcs of lightning danced over its hull, but it held together. It worked. Not because of any engineering principle Farron understood, but because Uzgob believed it would. The engine seer stared, his face a mask of utter devastation. His entire world-view, his faith in the omniscience, and the certainty of the machine spirit shattered more completely than it had been by his initial capture. He was led away by a grot, babbling incoherently about techno-heresies and the death of logic. We never saw him again. Success, however, was its own kind of damnation. I was put to work on a targeting system for a Gorkanaut, a colossal, walker-sized suit of Ork armor that stood like a scrap-metal god in the center of the yard. The system was a mess of loose, sparking wires, cracked and filthy lenses, and a targeting computer that was quite literally just a box of squirming, brain-like squigs that gnawed on the wiring. Uzgob, the Mekboy in charge, wanted it to see better. Driven by a desperate survivalist instinct, I didn't try to fix it in the imperial sense. I couldn't. There was nothing to fix. Instead, I played my part in the charade. I carefully rearranged the sparking wires into a pattern that looked more organized and intentional. I found a relatively clean rag and wiped the grime from the cracked lenses, making them look clearer. I then pointed at the squirming squig box and said, with as much conviction as I could muster, "It sees good now. The thinky squigs are aligned." Uzgob stomped over, peered into the eyepiece with one goggled eye and grunted. "Is less fuzzy. Good, Yumi. Yours less stupid than the rest." He believed it was better, and because he believed it, when he climbed into the Gorkonaut's cockpit and test-fired the arm-mounted Gatling blaster, the shots, a storm of solid slugs and energy bolts, actually converged on a single, unfortunate pile of scrap metal, shredding it instantly instead of spraying wildly across the yard, as was the usual Ork tendency.
I had done it. I had successfully contributed to the war machine of the enemy. I had used my intellect, my imperial training in diagnostics and systems to make the Xeno stronger, more accurate, more deadly. The guilt was a physical weight in my chest, a cold, hard stone of shame that sat heavy in my gut. I had become a collaborator. I had greased the wheels of the apocalypse. This was the Mekboyz yard. It wasn't just a place of forced labor. It was a forge for the soul, where your own rationality was the hammer and your conscience was the anvil. They were breaking us not with pain or fear, but with paradox. They were forcing us to accept that, in their world, reality was merely a suggestion, and our logic was just a tool to make their dreams of destruction come true. And in the constant, soul-grinding noise of the yard, the pounding, the sizzling, the roaring engines, I started to hear it too. A low, persistent hum at the edge of my hearing, a pulse that resonated not in my ears, but deep within my mind, vibrating in time with the erratic green glow of the Ork machinery. The Waha, it was a psychic static, a pressure against my sanity. It was trying to get in. And with every successful task, with every compromise of my principles, with every time I helped an impossible machine to function, I was opening the door a little wider, letting a little more of the green inside. The hum became a thrum, the thrum became a pulse, a low-frequency drumbeat that vibrated in the fillings of my teeth and resonated deep within the cage of my ribs. It was no longer an external sound, but an internal rhythm, a parasitic cadence that had taken root in my psyche. The Wah was no longer just a force that surrounded us. It was becoming a presence that lived within us, a second, alien heartbeat syncing with our own. I saw its effects everywhere, a creeping contamination of the mind. Back in the Cage would sometimes, without prompting, clench his bionic fist. The hydraulic claws would snap shut with a sharp pneumatic hiss, perfectly in time with the distant booming Ork war chant. In those moments, his human eye would lose focus, the pupil dilating, and a flicker of that same simple, brutal joy I saw on Ork faces would cross his own. He was fighting it. I could see the struggle in the clenching of his jaw, the tremor in his human hand. But the alien technology grafted to his body was a direct conduit for the psychic field, pumping the Ork consciousness into his nervous system like a potent, addictive drug. In the Mekboyz yard, the phenomenon was even more pronounced and terrifying. The other prisoners, the smart gits, began to change in subtle and then not so subtle ways. A junior tech priest from Lucius, who had initially spent every spare moment praying to the Omnisia for deliverance and muttering litanies of purification, now started absent-mindedly sketching designs in the dirt. But they weren't imperial designs. They were spiky, asymmetrical, overloaded with unnecessary barrels and exhaust ports. He'd mutter not about the sacred mysteries of the machine, but about the purity of the Bigaboom and more Daka. He wasn't just mimicking them, the very structure of his thoughts was being rewritten.
The Wa was a psychic fungus, and our stressed, broken minds with a fertile, unguarded ground in which its spores could take root and flourish. My own thoughts were no longer my sacred domain. In the few moments of exhausted semi-sleep I managed to snatch, violent, impulsive images would flash behind my eyes, unbidden and unwelcome. The satisfying, visceral crunch of a skull under a power maul, the adulating roar of a crowd as I stood victorious in the pit, drenched in blood, the simple, glorious, overwhelming noise of a fully automatic weapon firing on an endless belt, the heat of the barrel searing my hands. These were not my desires. I was a Cadian officer, a product of the Schola Progenium. I believed in discipline, order, sacrifice, and the calculated, efficient application of force. This was mindless barbarism. It was the antithesis of everything I had been taught to uphold. But it was a seductive barbarism. It promised a terrifyingly simple release from the constant grinding fear, the gnawing hunger, the crushing weight of guilt and powerlessness. To give in would be to stop thinking, to stop worrying, to stop remembering, to simply be, to fight, to eat, to bellow with the mob, to exist in a perpetual unthinking present. The temptation was a siren song in my head, growing louder and more persuasive with every passing day, its melody woven from the primal rhythms of the Wa. It all came to a catastrophic head during a massive gathering. The Orks were preparing for a new fight, a proper scrap against a rival warband that had taken up residence in a neighboring section of the rock. The energy in the cavern shifted, becoming electric, frenetic. The entire population, it seemed, had gathered in the central thoroughfare, a seething, roaring sea of green flesh, metal, and barely contained violence. The Nobs and the war boss himself, a giant of an orc, encased in massive, custom-forged armor that made him tower over his followers, stood on a dais constructed from the wreckage of imperial tanks. The war boss raised a power claw the size of a land raider. The cavern, miraculously, fell into a tense, anticipatory silence, broken only by the guttural breathing of 10,000 orcs. "Boys, ease are bored!" A unified, agreeing grumble rippled through the crowd, a sound like an avalanche of boulders. "These gits from the bad snaggers think they's hard. They think they can take our teeth. They think they can take our daca." A roar of outrage erupted from the mob, a physical wave of sound that made the very air pressure change. "Well, I say we go and take theirs. We go and crumb 'em good. We go and—" He paused for maximum dramatic effect, his single eye scanning the rapt faces of his boys. "Wah!" The effect was instantaneous and electric. It was not a word, it was a psychic detonation. The sound that erupted from 10,000 orc throats was not merely noise, it was a physical, visible wave of raw green energy that erupted from the mob. The very air shimmered with emerald light. I felt it hit me like a hammer blow to my soul. The constant hum in my head exploded into a roaring, all-consuming fire, drowning out every other thought, every memory, every shred of my identity. For a single, terrifying, and horrifyingly exhilarating second, I was not Captain Revis of the Cadian 112th. I was not a prisoner. I was part of the green tide. I felt the raw, joyous aggression course through me like a drug. I understood on a fundamental level the simple, perfect logic of the fight. My hand clenched into a fist, and I felt a surge of power, a desperate, overwhelming desire to grab the nearest sharp object and join the charge, to feel my weapon bite into flesh, and to hear the satisfying screams of the enemy. I opened my mouth, and a guttural alien sound almost escaped my lips. I looked across the cavern towards my cage. Ilara was there, her face a mask of pure terror, but for a fleeting, gut-wrenching moment, I saw her eyes widen as she looked at me. She saw the green fire in my gaze, the feral twist to my snarl. She saw the orc trying to get out.
The sight of her terror was a lifeline. I slammed my fists against my temples, fighting back with every shred of my imperial indoctrination, every memory of Cadia's proud spires, every prayer to the God-Emperor I could desperately recall. I pictured the stoic face of Colonel Strachan, the unbreakable will of the Catachan who was even now being consumed. The struggle was a war inside my own skull, a battle for my very soul, and it was the most brutal, desperate fight I had ever fought. The moment passed. The wave of energy receded. The Wa mob, a tsunami of green flesh and metal, charged out of the cavern, their roars fading into the distance, leaving a ringing, empty silence in their wake. I collapsed to the floor of the Mekboyz yard, trembling uncontrollably, drenched in a cold sweat that felt like ice water. I had resisted. I had clawed my way back from the brink. But it had been a close thing, a terrifyingly close thing. The door had been forced open, and I had felt what was on the other side. Back in his cage, Cage was pounding his bionic fist against the bars, over and over, his face a rictus of conflicting emotions, human revulsion and a deep, orcish yearning. The Wa was not just noise, it was not just energy, it was a contagion of the mind, and we were all infected. The question was no longer if we would break, but what form that break would take. Would our bodies be torn apart in the pits, or would our minds be utterly consumed from within, until we were nothing more than willing, eager slaves to the green tide, our humanity a forgotten dream?
With the majority of the orc mob gone on their Wa, the cavern felt strangely empty. But the silence that descended was, in its own way, more terrifying. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from the intimate sounds of suffering. The air, once vibrating with the roar of the horde, now carried the whimpers from the cages with chilling clarity, the skittering of grots taking on a sinister, conspiratorial tone, and the low, guttural commands of the overseers left behind felt more personal, more directed. I was deemed to have learned good in the Meks. With the majority of the orc mob gone on their Wa, the cavern felt strangely empty, but the silence that descended was, in its own way, more terrifying. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from the intimate sounds of suffering. The air, once vibrating with the roar of the horde, now carried the whimpers from the cages with chilling clarity, the skittering of grots taking on a sinister, conspiratorial tone, and the low, guttural commands of the overseers left behind felt more personal, more directed. I was deemed to have learned good in the Mekboyz yard and was temporarily reassigned. Uzgob, the Mekboy, had gone to war, his workshop quiet for the first time since my arrival. My mind, however, found no rest. Instead, I was handed over to a creature I found even more despicable than the mad doc, a run herd.
Run herds were older, crueler orcs, their green hides often gnarled and covered in warts, their spirits tempered by decades of dealing with the most sniveling, treacherous creatures in the galaxy, Gretchen and Snotlings. They were masters of the whip and the prod, and they viewed all lesser life forms, including humans, with a special kind of contempt. We weren't even worthy of being turned into weapons. We were merely beasts of burden, weaker and more pathetic than the grots they so despised. My new task was the most degrading yet. I was added to the herd. Along with a dozen other broken prisoners, the ones deemed too weak for the pits but still strong enough to walk, I was forced to work in the fungal farms. The farms were a revelation of a different kind of horror. They were vast, subterranean caves adjacent to the main cavern, lit by a sickly, bioluminescent glow that emanated from the fungi themselves. The soil was not soil at all, but a repulsive, spongy mulch of rotting waste, corpses, and fungal matter that squelched underfoot and released a foul gas with every step. The crops were various species of squigs, some small and skittering, others large and belligerent, and giant pulsating mushrooms that stood taller than a man, their gills weeping a viscous, sweet-smelling fluid. The air was thick with choking, psychedelic spores that coated the tongue and made the head swim. Reality began to warp at the edges. The distant screams from the main cavern would sometimes sound like hymns. The gurgle of a nearby sump would whisper my name. I saw the faces of my dead comrades staring at me from the intricate, glowing gills of the giant mushrooms, their mouths open in silent, accusatory screams. I heard the whispers of the Emperor, but they were twisted, corrupted, telling me to give in, to embrace the simplicity of the spore, to become part of the great, green, self-perpetuating machine of the orcoid race. The run herd, a hunchbacked, particularly vile orc named Scabguts, would stalk the perimeter of the farm, his long, electrified whip cracking over our heads. The sound was a constant reminder of our place. His grots, emboldened by his presence, would scurry among us, jabbing us with sharp sticks if we slowed down, stealing the pathetic rags we wore, their high-pitched laughter a constant, annoying counterpoint to the dread. Our job was to harvest the squigs. This meant wading into pens of the vicious, snapping creatures and grabbing them with our bare hands. It was a task of pure terror. The squigs were fast, aggressive, and their bites could take off a finger with ease. Many of the prisoners in the herd had missing digits, their hands a testament to the danger. Once caught, the writhing, screeching squigs would be tossed into wooden carts, where they would often immediately begin cannibalizing each other, the carts becoming a roiling mass of teeth and blood. The spores were the worst part. Breathing them in was not optional. They induced vivid, waking nightmares. One man, a former PDF sergeant named Evren, simply started laughing one day, a high, hysterical sound that held no humor. He dropped the squig he was holding, walked calmly towards a pit filled with ripper squigs, the small, voracious ones used for waste disposal, and stepped in. He was consumed in seconds, his laughter turning to brief, wet screams that were swiftly cut off. Scabguts just grunted, made a mark on a grimy slate, and muttered, "One less mouth to feed." It was that simple. We were inventory, and our loss was just a number on a tally. It was here, in this hellish bioluminescent garden, that I witnessed the full, horrifying life cycle of the orc. I saw snotlings, tiny, mindless creatures being used as living fertilizer, buried alive in the mulch to nourish the fungi. I saw Gretchen spawn from pulsating pods on the underside of the larger mushrooms, emerging fully formed and immediately sniveling and cowardly, yet knowing instinctively how to serve their orc masters. Most chilling of all, I saw a mature weapon-grade squig, if left uneaten, eventually burrow into the ground. Days later, the earth would rupture, and a fully grown orc would literally sprout from the earth, covered in slime and already bellowing for a fight. His first act was often to backhand the nearest grot. They were a fungus. A sentient, warlike, self-replicating plague. This was the truth that the Imperium's propaganda only hinted at. You couldn't defeat them by just killing them. For every one you slew on the battlefield, 100 more were growing in a dank, spore-choked cave like this one. The sheer biological inevitability of it was a despair deeper than any I had felt in the cages or the Meks yard. We were not just fighting an army. We were fighting a force of nature. A cancerous, intelligent, and endlessly self-replicating force of nature that saw the entire galaxy as its compost heap. During this time, my connection to Ilara and Cage was completely severed. I was isolated in the fungal caves, my mind slowly unspooling from the spores and the relentless, menial, terrifying labor. I was becoming less than a slave. I was becoming part of the ecosystem, a moving part in the great, green, self-perpetuating machine of the Orkoid race. The image of Cadia's proud spires was fading, replaced by the sight of glowing toxic mushrooms. The sound of imperial hymns was being overwritten by the crack of Scabguts's whip and the chittering of grots. I was being erased, not through dramatic violence, but through a slow, grinding assimilation into the most base and filthy level of orc society. I had hit bottom. I was a farmer in the garden of hell, tending the crops that would feed the very beasts that held me captive. And with every spore-filled breath, with every squig I tossed into the cannibalistic cart, I felt myself caring less and less. The fight was going out of me, replaced by a numb, fungal resignation.
Just when I thought I had sunk as low as a human soul could go, when the fungal apathy had nearly extinguished the last embers of my will, the Orks unveiled a new, more profound way to defile me. The war returned, but it was not a triumphant return. The mob came pouring back into the cavern, not with the cheerful, satisfied bellows of victors, but with the angry, frustrated roars of orcs who had been denied a proper fight. Their rival warband, the Bod Snaggers, had apparently fled, leading them on a chaotic chase through the asteroid fields with little actual combat. It was the ultimate insult, a promise of violence broken. The war boss was in a towering, incandescent fury. The psychic energy of the mob, charged to the brim with aggression and with no outlet, began to crackle and build like a thunderhead before a storm. It was a power surge seeking a ground, a storm of rage seeking earth, and it found a most unstable conductor. The weird boy. I had only heard whispers of them, creatures spoken of in the same hushed, fearful tones as demons or psychers gone wrong. Orcs who were so psychically attuned to the Wa that they could channel its raw, untamed energy, but at a terrible, unpredictable cost. They were unstable, walking bombs of psychic power, revered and feared in equal measure. As the mob's frustration reached a pitch fever, a hush fell over one section of the cavern.
The orcs, for once, actually parted, creating a wide berth, and the weird boy emerged from the shadows. He was a terrifying sight, unlike any orc I had seen. He was lean, almost emaciated, his green skin stretched tight over a twitching frame. His eyes glowed with a violent, internal green light that leaked smoky tendrils into the air. Wires, jagged pieces of metal, and barbed hooks were stabbed directly into his skull, acting as psychic lightning rods. He clutched his head, his body shuddering and convulsing as the unspent energy of the frustrated Wa coursed through him, a torrent he could not control. "It's gonna blow!" an orc near me muttered, and I was shocked to hear genuine nervousness in its guttural tone. The weird boy staggered into the center of the cavern, his movements jerky and unnatural. Green lightning, real and tangible, began to arc from his eyes and the metal rods in his head, earthing itself on the metal walls and floor with deafening cracks that echoed through the space. The orcs backed away further, giving him an even wider berth. This was a force of nature even they feared. His wild, burning gaze swept across the cavern, across the cages, across the Meks yard, a searchlight of pure psychosis. And then it landed on me. It felt like being physically struck by a hammer made of pure thought. I could feel his mind, a roiling, chaotic cauldron of alien thoughts, raw power, and immense pain latching on to mine. My mental shields, already battered by the constant pressure of the Wa, crumbled to dust. You humies, you have little thoughts, quiet thoughts, good for seeing things, good for focusing. He raised a twitching claw-like hand, and I was violently lifted from the ground by an invisible crushing force. A cage of crackling green energy, shimmering with barely contained power, formed around me, suspending me in the air before him like a specimen under a microscope. I was trapped, my mind laid bare. "The Wa wants to go somewhere," the weird boy's voice screamed inside my head, the pain immense. "It needs a proper fight. Show us a fight. Show us a shiny place, a place with lots of daka." I understood then. He was a diviner, a seer. But his own mind was too chaotic, too overloaded with the psychic static of the orc race to interpret the currents of the Wa clearly. He couldn't focus the vision. He needed a calmer, more structured human mind to use as a filter, a lens to sharpen the blurred images of fate. He needed a psychic, or, in my case, a human with just enough will and mental fortitude left to be useful, but not enough to resist. Images, memories began to be ripped from my mind. It was a psychic rape. The fall of Cadia, the sight of the planet breaking apart, the majestic, terrifying form of a black stone fortress, the gleaming, distant spires of the imperial palace on Holy Terra. He sifted through them like a miner panning for gold, discarding anything that didn't promise immediate visceral violence and loot. Terra was boring too far. Then his psychic claws dug even deeper into memories I had buried, locked away as strategic secrets. He found it, a memory from a command briefing on Viridia, a data slate showing a nearby system, Helios Prime, a Forge World, an Adeptus Mechanica stronghold. My mind presented the images he craved, the gleaming adamantium spires of the forges, the rivers of molten metal, the endless assembly lines producing tanks and laser guns, the vast orbital docks, the stockpiles of munitions, a world unimaginably rich with the shiny technology and daka the orcs craved, a world ripe for the taking.
Ooh, that one.
The weird boy roared with glee, both aloud and in my mind, the feedback nearly blinding me with pain. He projected the image, my own memory, into the air above the cavern for the entire mob to see. They saw the paradise I had shown them. They saw the ultimate prize. The war boss grinned, a wide, tusky smile of pure, unadulterated avarice. Now that's a proper target. Wah! The mob erupted, their frustration instantly transformed into united, ecstatic bloodlust. They had their new direction, a target worthy of a proper wah, and I had given it to them. The weird boy released me. The psychic cage vanished, and I dropped like a stone to the hard ground, my mind feeling violated, scraped raw, every memory tainted. I lay there, gasping, my body racked with phantom pains, my soul stained. I had just used my knowledge, my imperial military training and intelligence to direct the Ork horde towards a loyal, vital, imperial world. Millions would die. A forge world that supplied entire sectors would be ravaged, its technology perverted, its people enslaved or eaten. The repercussions would echo through the Imperium for decades, and it was my fault. The guilt was absolute, an anvil on my chest, crushing the last vestiges of my spirit. I had been broken in body by the labor, in mind by the spores and the Mekboyz yard, and now, finally, in soul, I had become a navigator for the apocalypse. I had looked into the swirling, insane heart of the Wa, and it had used my own eyes, my own memories, to find its next victim. I was no longer just a prisoner or a slave. I was a traitor. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there was no forgiveness for that.
Despair is not a sudden fall. It is a slow, cold poison that seeps into the marrow of your will, paralyzing it cell by cell. For a long time after the weird boy's violation, I simply existed. I was a hollow man, a puppet with its strings cut, moved from the fungal farms back to my old cage. The sights and sounds of the cavern registered, but they no longer held meaning. They were just patterns of light and noise against the vast gray void that had become my consciousness. Ilara was gone, taken in a selection while I had been lost in the spore-choked gardens. I did not know her fate, whether she fed an Ork's belly or the Mad Doc's experiments, or simply lay broken in some forgotten pile. Her absence was just another empty space in a world defined by them. Cage was still there, but he was more machine than man now. He sat motionless for hours, the only sign of life the faint, sickly green pulse of the wiring in his bionic claw and the low, subvocal growl that rumbled in his chest, a sound that was becoming less human every day. His humanity was almost entirely subsumed, the last embers drowning in the tide of the Wa that flowed through his augmetics. The Orks, meanwhile, were in a frenzy of preparation for their assault on Helios Prime. The cavern, usually a study in chaotic but predictable rhythms, was now a maelstrom of frantic activity. The Mekboyz yard was a constant explosion of light and sound as Uzgab and his crew worked tirelessly to arm the fleet. The Dark's workshop buzzed and screamed as it churned out a new wave of modified boys, their bodies crudely augmented for the coming fight. The runt herds whipped the grots into a frenzy, herding them towards the boarding craft. The energy was palpable, a fever pitch of anticipation that made the very air crackle. It was this very chaos, this breakdown of the brutal order that usually governed the prison, that presented a sliver of opportunity. The strict hierarchies and watchful eyes of the Nobs were distracted by the grand scale of the impending Wa. The guards were fewer, their attention divided.
For the first time since my capture, I saw a flaw in their system, a crack in the immense green wall of our captivity. It was Cage who pointed it out. His voice, when he spoke, was a grating mechanical thing, a fusion of human vocal cords and bionic static, but the words were clear, and they were his. "The water," he rasped, his human hand trembling as he pointed a finger towards the lower levels of the cavern, away from the main thoroughfares. I forced my eyes to focus, to follow his gesture. A sluggish, foul-smelling stream of water, runoff from the fungal caves and other less savory sources, ran through a carved channel in the rock floor. It drained towards the outer hull of the rock, disappearing through a large, rusted grate set into the cavern wall. The grate was old, corroded by centuries of moisture and neglect, and had been battered and repaired countless times with haphazard welds. One of the vertical bars was visibly bent outward, creating a narrow, dark gap. An escape. Not to freedom. Freedom was an impossible concept, a fairy tale for children. We were in the depths of a rock hurtling through the airless void. There was no out to this place, but it was an escape to a different fate, a choice, to die on our own terms, by our own will, rather than live as a resource for the Xenos, to choose the cold, clean embrace of the void over the hot, living, squalid hell of the Ork prison. "The void is on the other side," I said, my voice a dry, unused croak, stating the obvious, making it real. Cage nodded, a slow, mechanical motion. "Better than the pit, better than the dock, better than being their tool." He flexed his power claw, the pistons hissing. "Better than becoming this." He was right. This was the only victory left to us, the final, defiant act of a human spirit, to deny them our bodies, our minds, our usefulness, to choose nothing over being their thing. A plan, fragile and desperate as a spider's web in a storm, began to form. We would wait for the moment of the Wah's launch. At the very peak of the chaos, when every Ork's attention was utterly focused on the coming fight, we would make our move. It was a slim chance, but it was a chance to spit in the eye of the galaxy before we died. The signal came with an earth-shattering, deep-space roar that dwarfed all previous sounds. The main engines of the rock ignited. The entire structure shuddered violently, as if gripped by a colossal hand. Great stone doors, massive beyond comprehension, began to grind open in the cavern ceiling far above, revealing the star-dusted, absolute blackness of the void. The Ork fleet was moving out. The attack on Helios Prime had begun. "Wah!" The cry was a single, unified blast of sound and psychic energy that shook the very foundations of reality. It was the perfect distraction. Now. Cage, summoning the last reserves of his human strength and coupling it with the savage power of his bionic claw, turned to the cage door. He wedged the sharp tips of the claw into the heavy, rusted lock. Muscles, both flesh and metal, strained. The metal of the lock screamed in protest, a high-pitched shriek lost in the general din. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a final, grating shriek of tearing iron, the lock mechanism shattered, and the cage door swung open. We were free. For the first time in a lifetime, we were outside the cage. We moved like ghosts, clinging to the shadows of towering piles of scrap and machinery. The chaos was our ally, our cloak. Other prisoners saw us, their eyes wide with a mixture of desperate hope and sheer terror. We could not save them. We could only offer them an example, a final act of rebellion. A few, seeing what we were doing, found a spark of their own. They began to break out of their own cages, creating diversions, attacking isolated grots with their bare hands and teeth in a final, glorious and futile act of defiance. The cavern, for a few brief minutes, became a scene of beautiful, chaotic insurrection. We scrambled down the rough, rocky face of the cavern wall towards the drainage channel. The water was freezing and stank of decay and chemical runoff, but we waded into it, our movements urgent, pushing towards the grate. The bent bar was our target, our gateway to oblivion. Cage wedged his power claw into the narrow gap and began to pull. The hydraulic pistons in his arm hissed and strained. The muscles in his neck and shoulder corded with the effort. The rusted metal of the grate groaned, then shrieked in protest, with a final, tearing sound that was like the rock itself crying out. The bar ripped free from its welds. It was enough. A narrow, jagged opening, just wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. I looked at Cage. He shook his head. The gesture was final. I will not fit. His bionic arm and broad, augmented shoulders were too large. He was staying behind. This was not his escape. It was his last stand, his final act of redemption. Go, he growled, his static-filled voice firm despite the static. One of us must bear witness. Tell them what it is like. There was no time for arguments, for farewells, for gratitude that felt too vast for words. I simply clasped his human arm, a final, fleeting touch of humanity, of brotherhood in this hell. His skin was cold. Then I turned and squeezed through the jagged, tearing metal of the opening, scraping my skin raw, not caring about the pain. I was through. I was in a dark, marrow-dripping tunnel, a coolant duct, or a waste chute that sloped downwards into the cold, unfeeling rock of the rock's outer shell. Behind me, I heard Cage let out a roar, not the guttural bellow of an orc, but a pure, defiant human scream that cut through the cacophony. He had turned to face the horde, his claw whirring to life one last time, a lone soldier making his final stand against the green tide. I did not look back. I ran. I ran through the darkness, towards the growing hum of the engines, towards the promise of nothingness. I ran from the green, from the noise, from the horror. I ran towards the only freedom left to me. The sweet, silent, and absolute oblivion of the void.
The tunnel was a throat of rusted metal and weeping rock, swallowing me whole. The roar of the orc cavern faded behind, replaced by the deeper, more profound vibration of the rock's engines, a bass note that thrummed through the metal under my hands and feet. I ran not with hope, but with a desperate final purpose. The air grew thinner, colder, whistling as it was pulled towards the void. The stench of the orcs was gone, replaced by the clean metallic tang of vacuum and ozone. I was close. The tunnel ended abruptly at a precipice. A jagged opening in the rock's hull, a wound in the starship's side opened onto the infinite black. There was no railing, no warning, just the sheer drop into nothingness. I stood on the edge, my body trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion and the final crushing weight of understanding. The rock was moving, a mountain of scrap and malevolence tearing through the void.
Below me, the massive, poorly shielded engines glowed like malevolent suns, and beyond them I could see the receding star of the Helios system, the system I had doomed. The air was thin here, my breath pluming in the freezing cold, the scant atmosphere whistling out into the vacuum. The cold was absolute, a clean, pure cold that seared my lungs but was a welcome baptism after the humid, fungal stink of the prison. It felt like purity after a lifetime of corruption. I stood on the edge, the void calling to me with a silence more profound than any I had ever known. It would be so easy. One step, and end to the hunger, the fear, the guilt. A final defiant act of control, to choose how it ended. But as I looked out into that immense, star-dusted darkness, a final chilling truth settled upon me, colder than the void itself. It wrapped around my heart a chain of realization that anchored me to the precipice. Escape was an illusion. Even if I did not jump, even if by some miracle I could not comprehend, an Imperial vessel were to find this drifting hulk and rescue me, I could never truly leave. I had been marked, branded on a level deeper than flesh. The Wa was in my blood now. I could still feel its hum, a permanent scar on my psyche, a tinnitus of the soul. In my quiet moments, for the rest of my life, whether that life lasted seconds or decades, I would hear the distant echo of the war chants. I would feel the stir of that mindless aggression in the back of my mind, a caged beast waiting for a trigger. I would dream in green. I would startle at the sound of metal clanging, my heart racing with a Pavlovian terror. The smell of fungus and promethium would forever be the smell of home. I had become a living chronicle of their horror. My mind was a library of their ways, their strengths, their terrifying, illogical power. To die here would be to let that knowledge die with me, to grant them one final victory by silencing the only witness who understood the full, insidious depth of their evil. But to live with it? To carry this poison inside me back to the Imperium? To see the suspicion in my comrades' eyes, to feel the alien pulse in my own mind forever? That was its own eternal prison. There was no cage anymore, because I was the cage. This is the final horrifying truth of Ork prison. It does not end when you leave the cage. The cage comes with you. It is welded to your soul. They break you not just for the duration of your captivity, but for whatever remains of your life. You become a walking, talking testament to the fact that in this dark and terrible universe, there are fates far worse than death. There are fates that poison you, that change you on a fundamental level, ensuring that no matter where you go, you will always, always be a prisoner of the Wa. I took a deep, ragged breath of the thin, freezing air. It burned my lungs, a feeling more real and immediate than any I had felt in months. I would not jump. Not yet. The Emperor had not protected me in that hell, but he had given me a will that, though battered and broken, had not been entirely extinguished. That will, that last stubborn spark of the man I used to be, refused to let the Orks have the final say. My duty was not over. This story, this testament, had to be told. The Imperium had to know. They had to understand that the Orks are not just brutes. They're a putrid psychic plague, a corruption that can infest the mind itself. I turned my back on the void. The decision was made. The path back was unclear, fraught with peril beyond imagining. I was deep inside an Ork warship heading into battle. I was unarmed, half-starved, and mentally scarred. I would likely be recaptured, and my fate would be more horrific than anything I had yet experienced. But I had to try. For Cage, who had bought my escape with his last stand, for Alara and the boy in the cage and the engine seer from Ryza, for every soul consumed by the green tide,
I would be their voice. For now, the story ends here, on the edge of the abyss, with a single defiant act of turning away. But the war is never over, and neither is the duty of a soldier of the Imperium.
This has been the testimony of Captain Revis, Cadian 1/12. If you have the strength to bear such truths, to stare into the darkness of the 41st millennium and not go mad, then I urge you to support this channel. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a descent into the grimdark. For in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and the stories of those who survive it.